Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. Today we are going to discuss about a module, Urbanization and the Informal Economy, under the paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. The objective of this module is to provide you an overview on the genesis and the evolution of informal sector, and we will also consider some of the alternative definitions and perspectives to understand informal economy. After reading this module, you will be able to understand the processes underlying informalization and place them in a broader historical context and how informalization has emerged during the past. Lastly, it will also help you understand the spatial correlates and dynamism of the informal economy. An unusual scene in any Indian city or in the South Asia also is the bewildering variety of higglers, vendors, hawkers, waste pickers and rickshaw pullers on city streets and bazaars, and that appears to be an immemorial feature of the urban landscapes. But till 1997, the policymakers had no term for this group of workers, and there was a little comprehension of their unique contributions and tribulations in the city. The policy recognition of the informal sector has come through the sustained advocacy by the unions, associations, and the workers' groups. More broadly, in this module, the argument is that the informal livelihoods can be best understood within the broader context of labor history in India and a long-standing role of labor contractors who were called by various names like jobbers, sardars, and the like. So this module traces the conceptual evolution of the informal as a category of urban livelihoods, both internationally and in India, and relates it to the alternative lenses on informality in habitat and as a mode of urbanization. This module asks, what is the genesis of the idea of the informal sector? How can it be defined and measured? What processes encourage its rise and what are the spatial ramifications? Examining alternative frameworks that seek to explain the informal economy, that is the dualist, the legalist, and the structuralist, this model highlights the salience of processes of informalization in the Indian context that places these trends against the larger background of the labor history in India and the long-standing role of the contractors, as I said before. To understand why the informal economy is so central to Indian cities, consider that even in 2010, nearly 4/5 of urban employment was informal. Over time, India's workforce has been becoming more rather than less informal. An analysis of 3 rounds of NSSO in 1999, 2004-05 and 2009-10 data by the economists Martin Chen and G. Ravindran showed that just under 80% of all urban workers were informally employed. And this category included informal wage employment and self-employment in informal enterprises and informal wage employment for formal enterprises and households. Furthermore, Chen and Ravindran showed that in 2009-10, over 40% of the urban workforce was self-employed, and even of the wage workers, 67% or 2/3 were informal. Street vendors comprised about 11% of total urban employment in 2009 and 10. It is evident that informal employment cannot be ignored in any examination of Indian cities and their economy. In the next section, we are going to sketch out the evolution of concept from its origin in the 1970s onwards. So how do we recognize the informal sector? The genesis of this concept of informal sector lay firmly in the essence of economic development as a national and international policy priority and the emergence of an international development policy architecture anchored in the United Nations and its organizations such as International Labour Organization. Thus, to understand why informal forms of work and self-employment took so long to come to attention of policymakers, it is important to return to the most influential economic development paradigms of this era after World War II and before 1970s. In classical models of economic development, such as those outlined by the noted economist W. Arthur Lewis, urbanization is linked to structural transformation, that is, a decline in economic importance of agriculture, fishing, mining and other primary sector activities, and a corresponding increase in employment and output contributions of manufacturing, trade and service activities. The traditional sector, that is rural and primary sector, had unlimited reserves of underemployed workers. This workforce could be induced to migrate to modern sector located in urban center with the promise of a higher wage. In its essence, such dualistic models predicated the absorption of large numbers of rural migrants into high-paying modern sector jobs. However, by the mid-1960s, high levels of unemployment and underemployment were all too visible in third world cities. Contrary to the predictions of Lewis and others, analysis of employment data in developing countries showed that there were many fewer modern jobs than there were people wanting to fill them. Economists such as Hans Singer argued that dualism in labor markets, that is, structural differentials in wages across the modern and traditional sectors, and it showed characteristics of persistence with high levels of casual and intermittent employment as well as disguised or open unemployment. It was in response to these empirical anomalies that the ILO's World Employment Program came about. Of the many World Employment Program country missions, the 1972 Kenya country mission of the World Employment Program was the one to give recognition to the informal sector. The credit for coining the term informal, however, goes to the anthropologist Keith Hart, who offered an extensive analysis of informal income opportunities, both legitimate and illegitimate. However, while Hart largely equated informality with self-employment, the World Employment Program suggested a larger set of features to define informal sector activity. That was small-scale enterprise, self-employment, and family ownership, reliance on indigenous resources, labor-intensive activity, low capital requirements, low-intensive technology, low skills, ease of entry into activity, operations in unregulated competitive markets, among others. So how do we define the informal sector? Though this definition captures many aspects of the observed realities, but as Setu Raman pointed out, the informal sector universe remains vague because of multiple criteria. Because each criterion can be used to define a universe of its own. Consequently, one is not certain about the universe to which the term refers to. This ambiguity has also affected attempts to estimate the size and extent of the informal sector. Other broader conceptualizations of informal sector also exist in the literature. For instance, in discussing the contrasting roles of the informal sector in East Asian Latin American development, Gariffi and Chang offer three independent characterizations of the informal sector. These include 1. Social marginality, that is, labor dislocation and concentration in service sector activities defines the economic nature of informality. 2. Lack of state regulation, that is, the genesis of the informal sector lies in the strategies adopted by employers to avoid state regulation of the labor process. And third, small firms, that is, Both social marginality and absence of state regulation are conditions that more often prevail in smaller establishments. Nonetheless, as Chen notes, both Hart and the Kenya mission saw the informal sector as less a problem in itself and more a solution to issues of employment and productivity. Over the years, the perspective has shifted quite dramatically. As Sood notes, the influential Walmart theory of economic development associates high productivity with formal firms and in particular with large formal firms. This dualist paradigm, empirically upheld by economists such as Laporta and Schaeffer, suggests that the informal or unofficial economy, with its millions of entrepreneurs, had little to contribute to modern economies and can be expected to disappear over time. One highly controversial yet influential approach to understanding informality comes from the work of the Peruvian entrepreneur Hernando de Soto. In books such as The Mystery of Capital and The Other Path, de Soto has offered a legalist and quintessentially neoliberal policy diagnosis and prescription for the problem of informality in the developing economies. But why property rights or tenure is important? Let us take up a case of a street vendor who has been setting up a stall, selling hosiery or fruits at the same location at a busy bazaar intersection for many years. Though she has certain customary and informal claims over the plot, these claims are not legally recognized. Such a street vendor, in fact, would likely face constant harassment and threats of eviction from municipal authorities and police. As her rights over the plot are not secure, she cannot invest in a more profitable permanent structure, nor can she raise capital or obtain credit with the plot as collateral. And should she wish to pursue a different trade in a different city, she cannot sell or monetize her rights over the plot. In all these ways and more, informal property rights become a barrier to efficient market exchange and growth of the street vendors enterprise. De Soto's analysis has not focused specifically on urban livelihoods, but it traces the urgency to reform to the explosion of slums and favelas in the cities of the global south. An important contribution of De Soto's framework lies in its ability to cut through the definitional ambiguities surrounding the idea of the informal that was discussed in the previous section. While the power and appeal of De Soto's idea should be evident, they rest on value assumptions that have come under sustained critique. Examining the claims advanced by De Soto on the basis of empirical evidence from another South American city, Bogota in Colombia, Gilbert questions many of the benefits of such legalizations. In Bogota and elsewhere, formal land markets worked effectively even without formal property rights. Moreover, investment in housing improvement by poor remained independent of the formal legal status of the land. A key finding was that possession of a legal title made little or no difference to the availability of formal finance. In Indian contexts, scholars such as Ananya Roy has delivered a far more scathing assessment of the De Soto approach. Roy argues against the neoliberal self-help underpinnings of legalizations as a panacea, but her contention goes deeper. In her view, state power is reproduced through the capacity to construct and reconstruct categories of legitimacy and illegitimacy. Similarly, the work of Benjamin and Raman does not directly address De Soto's analysis, but it does suggest the remarkable density and diversity of tenure arrangements on the ground in Bangalore, ranging from outright sale, partnership deals between plot owners and entrepreneurs to types of leasing, among many others. Moreover, it challenges simplistic promotion of homogenized tenure because of its role in effectively excluding poor groups. These theorizations are examined in greater detail in other modules as well. So we have discussed in earlier parts, but now let us elaborate a little bit more on the idea of informalization and how it has grown in the past, or how it is growing in the current scenario also. So growth of such informal employment as a share of the total workforce, or in that is also called as this informalization, is analyzed by Unni, who traces two major pathways for the shift. One, the spatial setting of work has been transformed by subcontracting. That is, the workers move from factories where they had some degree of labor protection to small workshops and homes. And home-based workers are in fact a substantial part of the urban informal economy. The second dimension of the informal employment is the for informal enterprises, that even those workers who stay in factories face casualization. That is, they have looser contracts and very few productions also. If you look at informalization in a historical perspective, some of the processes have counterparts in labor history in the role played by the jobbers, sardars, kanagis, and the mistris of the early industrial India. As Chandravarkar notes that in Mumbai's textile industry, the jobber straddled the boundaries between the workplace and the neighborhood. His functions included not only shop floor discipline but also the power to hire and fire. So, in a context where daily employment was a significant component of the workforce, the jobber served as the enforcer of a regime of casualization. Further, through his influence in the chores and on his recruitment strategies, the jobber also worked to undermine the possibility of collective action by the workers. If spatial agglomeration is at the heart of urbanization, then how can we especially locate informal sector within the city? So the other manifestations of the economy, that is the settlement linkage between visible in studies of slum economies. The many studies of Dharavi, that is in Mumbai's emblematic Basti, show how caste networks have shaped its economy and fostered the rise of a vibrant and largely informal leather goods sector. Slagio Yeltis-Mirsky argues that Dharavi represents a globalized informal sector, with a significant proportion of its output going to exports. So, although casualization hits workers hard, it provides some kind of production flexibility to leather products, traders, and companies. For the worker, it trades off unemployment or underemployment for under and uncertain payment. The economic dynamism of the informal economy thus calls into question dualist discourses that describe it as marginal or waning. After looking at some of the conceptual and other approaches to the informal economy, this section turns to the Indian experience and attempts a more historical, empirical understanding of the informal sector. In India, the informal sector has been known by several names, but a commonly used term has been the unrecognized sector. In 2004, the central government set up the National Commission for Enterprises in Unorganized Sector, with a broad mandate to recognize and support workers in the unorganized sector. Extending social protections to unorganized workers was central to the mission of the National Commission for Enterprises in Unorganized Sector, that is NCEUS. For the purpose of the Indian data, the NCEUS modified and tailored internationally accepted ICLS definitions and the informal sector and informal employment. It defined the informal or unorganized sector as the unorganized sector consists of all unincorporated private enterprises owned by individuals or households engaged in the sale and production of goods and services, operated on a proprietary or partnership basis, and with less than 10 workers. As far as the informal or unorganized employment was concerned, unorganized workers consist of those working in the unorganized enterprises or households, excluding regular workers with social security benefits, and workers in the formal sector without any employment or social security benefits provided by the employers. A few features of these definitions are interesting to note. First, the NCEUS only partially incorporated the terminology of informal in its work. Second, the NCEUS definition of the unorganized sector did not distinguish between agriculture and non-agricultural, rural or urban. Thus, this was one of the broadest definitions ever adopted, and the NCEUS estimated that in 2004-5, informal workers were an overwhelming 92% of Indian workforce. Third, taking the centrality of social production perspective of the work of the NCEUS is evident in its definition. Kannan and Papola highlighted NCEUS findings showing that the high congruence between the proportion of workers in the unorganized sector and this general state of poverty and economic vulnerability. Further, the NCEUS also found that 57% of urban informal wage workers received wages below the nationally recommended minimum wages. Kannan and Papola also reported the unsanitary working conditions, long hours, and exploitative relationships that characterize the informal economy. The NCEUS's policy recommendations reinforce the need to expand the social security net as well as stricter enforcement of labor regulations. Authors such as Jan Bremen have argued powerfully against the dualist paradigm of the informal economy. Looking at the repercussions from the 1991 textile mill closures in Ahmedabad, Bremen challenges the notion that workers prefer self-employment in the informal sector. Instead, he argues that the workers who lost jobs in the mills were forced into such informal employment in the absence of good opportunities for formal employment. The growth of such informal employment as a share of the total workforce, or informalization, is also analyzed by Unni, who traces two major pathways for the shift. One, the spatial setting of work has been transformed by subcontracting, that is, workers move from factories where they had some degree of labor protection to small workshops and homes. Second, informal enterprises, that is, even those workers who stay in factories face casualization, that is, looser contacts and fewer protections. In fact, some of the processes have counterparts in labor history in the role played by jobbers, sardars, and mistris of early industrial India. Bremen's study of Ahmedabad highlights how these processes work. He notes that mill workers had reduced the size of the permanently employed workforce even in the 1980s by not replacing retired workers or replacing them with workers on more casual contracts. In other cases, work was contracted out to informal jobbers. As Unni notes, such informalization has a clear gender dimension, with women being less represented in the formal sector and dominant among home workers. Bremen highlights how caste networks determine the probability of obtaining high quality employment, also the increasing exclusion of Muslim workers from the formal jobs in Ahmedabad mills. Nandini Gupta's study of the declining jute mills in Kolkata in 2005 shows how increasing casualization and precariousness of work in these factories was accompanied by overcrowding in the petty trade and service sectors and small manufacturing as workers sought alternative niche. While Unni and Bremen focus on contemporary transformations, providing a historic perspective. Barbara Harris White and Gupta assert that from the time of independence and before, formal employers in the capitalist sector were able to avoid strict enforcement of labor laws, partly through implicit sanction from the state actors. Thus, a focus on the processes that foster the rise of the informal sector through the structuralist lens of informalization demonstrate the questions of political economy. That is, the relative power of capital and labor in shaping outcomes for workers. Here, the informal economy emerges as a side effect of decisions made by the large capital. As Rajchandra Worker notes in Mumbai's textile industry, the jobbers straddled the boundaries between workplace and neighborhood. His functions included not only shop floor discipline but also the power to hire and fire. In a context where daily employment was a significant component of the workforce, the jobber served as the enforcer of a regime of casualization. Further, through his influence in the chawls and his recruitment strategies, the jobbers also worked to undermine possibilities of collective action by workers. Thus, the looming presence of labor intermediaries in Indian industry has helped undercut labor protections and foster casualization, much like the contemporary migrants contractors as discussed in module 2.2. So far we have discussed the informal sector in a framework largely divorced from its spatial context. If spatial agglomeration is at the heart of urbanization, how can we spatially locate the formal sector within the city? Indeed, informal economies, livelihoods and labor markets are deeply interconnected with questions of informal shelter and habitat as discussed in other modules. Bremen's account from Ahmedabad reveals how processes of informalization have shaped the spatial contours of the city over the last 4 decades. The central part of the city, which housed the mills, are increasingly dilapidated and abandoned as the locus of economic activity in the city shifts elsewhere. This process consolidates the social segregation of Muslim communities. The economic transformation of the city has thus shifted its spatial axis. Petrochemical companies, cement manufacturers, textile power looms, and diamond processors set up in industrial areas outside the eastern boundaries of the city. Their workers, often rural migrants, have come to be housed in informal settlements in this part of the city. On the other hand, the relative expansion of the services sector on the western banks of the Sabarmati have generated new forms of informal employment. The manifestations of the economy settlement linkage became visible in the studies of slum economies. The many studies of Dharavi, Mumbai's emblematic Basti, show how caste networks have shaped its economy and fostered the rise of a vibrant and largely informal leather goods sector. Leather work has traditionally been associated with Dalit community in Dharavi. The Tamil Adi Dravidas were the first to set up tanneries. Other caste groups such as Marathi chambars, cobblers by occupation and the dhol tanners, in addition to Muslim communities, were also part of in the labor industry. Although leather workshops in Dharavi continue to remain small scale and informal, they in fact work as subcontractors for formal companies. Thus, Dharavi's workshops pass on the cost savings they generate from avoiding labor protections onto these organized sector outlets. Interestingly, even these contracts also remain informal and verbal with legal backings. This also reduces the bargaining power of leather artisans because if prices fall, other workers may be willing to work at lower prices. Although casualization hits workers hard, it provides production flexibility to leather products, traders and companies. For the worker, it trades off unemployment or underemployment for under or uncertain payment. Once again, a structuralist analysis that recognizes the cost saving and labor regulation evading functions of the informal economy seems most applicable to the nature of Dharavi's leather sector. Despite its undeniable success, is not unique in connecting the informal economy to the setting of informal habitations. Like in module ordinary cities, we have discussed about Bholakpur. In Hyderabad, for example, the Bholakpur Basti has similarly played the host of a globally connected waste processing industry. The economic dynamism of the informal economy thus calls into question dualist discourses that describe it as marginal or waning. So, students, let us summarize what we have learned in this module. Though it is often missing from policy debates, the importance of the informal economy in India's cities cannot be gainsaid. This module has aimed to provide an overview to the concept of the informal economy and to examine alternative explanations, that is the dualist perspective, the legalist perspective, and the structuralist perspectives that explains its trajectory. So in this process, the module has explored and challenged many misunderstandings of the sector, that it only includes self-employment and that it remains marginal and disconnected from the formal and global economy. Instead, the discussion that we had has demonstrated that the informal economy has clear spatial correlates and is deeply enmeshed in national and international trade and economic circuits. Most importantly, the concerns of the informal livelihoods remain firmly embedded in the larger trajectory of industrial and labor relations in India and since the colonial times. So the contemporary processes of informalization appear to find historical echo in the role of labor intermediaries in the factories of pre-independence India. So this module has examined the nature of informality in livelihood in the cities also. In the next two modules that we are going to cover, we will examine the manifestations of informality in settlements and as a mode of urbanization also. However, the informal economy and the struggles around it will emerge as salient in other modules as well. For example, on transit, where questions of the regulatory burden on informal transport on informal transport providers such as rickshaw come to the fore, and it also brings in discussions around the public space and the street vendors. Thank you.